Gentili signore, egregi signori, benvenuti alla 12ª edizione degli eventi letterari Monteverità. Siamo molto felici di potervi accogliere qui al Palacinema, di poter partire ancora una volta da qui. Palacinema che, lo sappiamo, in un certo senso rappresenta simbolicamente le aspirazioni di crescita culturale di questa regione e che sicuramente, superati gli scossoni di questi mesi, saprà dimostrare a tutti noi di avere ancora delle carte importanti da giocarsi. La manifestazione che inauguriamo questa sera esiste perché a modo nostro vogliamo contribuire a far splendere in modo nuovo il mito e quel simbolo luminoso e ormai mitico che è il Monte Verità. E questo lo facciamo da una parte per rafforzare questo territorio, facendone un punto di incontro tra nord e sud e nord e non soltanto, ma lo facciamo anche perché pensiamo che Monte Verità, inteso come il tentativo di trovare altri modi di approcciare le nostre vite, sia più importante che mai. Come sappiamo, il direttore artistico Stefan Zweifel, insieme ai curatori Stefano Knuchel e Maike Abad, ha deciso di dedicare questa edizione al centenario del manifesto surrealista. Proprio in questi giorni abbiamo letto sui giornali di come l'intelligenza artificiale stia portando ad assistere, forse addirittura ad una rinascita del surrealismo. Proprio come allora stiamo vivendo un periodo di forti sconvolgimenti politici e sociali. E se all'epoca i surrealisti lavoravano con le nuove forme d'arte di allora, i nuovi media come il cinema, la fotografia, la pubblicità stampata, oggi l'intelligenza artificiale sembrerebbe aprire possibilità creative inimmaginabili. Sembrerebbe poterci confrontare con qualcosa che sembra contenere in sé l'irrazionalità, anche se in realtà non si tratta altro che di una grande potenza di calcolo basata su qualcosa che è già dato. In fin dei conti l'intelligenza artificiale non è altro che un'intelligenza statistica, le cui immagini, per quanto mirabolanti, non possono altro che dare un surrealismo di facciata. Noi sappiamo invece che il surrealismo è ben altro che estetica, è molto di più. Surrealismo significa anche relativizzare la componente razionale a favore dell'assoluta libertà dell'inconscio, in favore del gioco disinteressato del pensiero. Contrappasso probabilmente necessario ancora oggi, perché come sappiamo la ragione che non vede i propri limiti diventa stupida, soprattutto se come in quest'epoca viene applicata soprattutto alle cose esterne. Basti pensare alla tecnologia e a come in qualche modo ci sta dominando tutti quanti. Ovviamente il fatto che siamo qui oggi e che potremo poi trascorrere, spero ancora insieme, così numerosi, delle magnifiche giornate al Monte Verità, lo dobbiamo anche a dei partner che con la loro generosità e con il loro supporto materiale e morale rendono possibile il nostro lavoro, a partire dal nostro main partner, la Mobiliare, che ci sostiene nell'ambito del proprio impegno verso la società, il Gesellschaftsengagement, ma anche le diverse fondazioni private che ci sostengono, il Board of Patrons che stiamo lentamente ricostruendo. Poi chiaramente ci sono diversi partner istituzionali, a partire dalla Fondazione Monte Verità, Ascona Locarno Turismo, a cui va dato il grande merito di aver riconosciuto da subito che un evento come questo non può essere misurato in termini meramente numerici. E poi il Cantone Ticino, con il Dipartimento della Cultura, di cui la direttrice, la responsabile, la ministra Carobbio, ci porta il saluto, oggi purtroppo è impegnata per un impegno istituzionale a Berna. E non da ultimo, o meglio da ultimo, il Comune di Ascona, che ci sostiene sin dall'inizio con il suo sindaco, per l'ultima volta oggi con noi in questa funzione, Luca Pissoglio. Luca, è stato un grande onore poter lavorare insieme a te, tu che insieme a Marco Solari, ora cittadino onorario di Locarno, insieme al compianto Eros Bergonzoli, ad Aldo Merlini e a Manuele Bertoli avete fondato questa manifestazione. A voi va la nostra promessa che faremo tutto il possibile per dispiegarne ulteriormente i potenziali che ci sono ancora e a portarla avanti nel rispetto dei valori fondanti che abbiamo in parte citato. Tutti questi partner e queste persone, insieme agli altri che trovate in fondo al programma che dovreste aver ricevuto all'ingresso, vanno ringraziati anche perché, se torniamo alla domanda del perché esistiamo, è perché questa manifestazione, come del resto anche le altre manifestazioni della Primavera Locarnese, l'Immagine e la Parola, Festival Libro, ma anche lo stesso Locarno Film Festival, possono essere viste come uno dei tanti elementi possibili per la costituzione di una nuova coscienza, una coscienza simbolica, intesa come la capacità di non essere sempre solo letterali e concretisti, di leggere tutto in modo lapalissiano, come se il mondo fosse solo concreto e oggettivo, ma una coscienza consapevole del fatto che il reale è fatto di un dentro e di un fuori e che tutto ciò che viviamo è un continuo mescolamento di fattori psichici e di fattori materiali. Lo abbiamo visto 100 anni fa, non è di certo abbandonando la razionalità che si possono evitare le guerre, ma non è di sicuro neanche eliminando fisicamente il proprio avversario che si possono risolvere certe cose. E come sempre probabilmente ci vuole la sintesi più intelligente possibile. Il senso di quello che facciamo è anche quello di tornare a questo punto di equilibrio, a questo punto di convivenza così difficile, consapevoli del fatto che ogni forma di ricerca esistenziale sottolinea l'importanza del mantenere in tensione degli opposti. Io sono fiducioso che quanto a cui assisteremo questa sera, ma anche nei prossimi giorni, saprà dare un contributo a queste intenzioni. Spero che lo potremo vivere insieme e come spero anche che potremo stare insieme quando ci verrà offerto un risotto ai funghi, forse allucinogeni, da parte di Enjoy Arena al terzo piano dopo il dialogo. Grazie, buon festival e a te la parola Luca.
Gentili signore, egregi signori, è per me un grande piacere, ma una grande emozione essere qui questa sera che mi appresto a fare il mio ultimo saluto ad un evento ufficiale. Il piacere è dato dal fatto che dopo 24 anni di municipio, durante i quali la cultura mi è stata molto a cuore, l'addio lo do in una manifestazione culturale e questo mi emoziona molto. 12 anni fa, come diceva il Presidente, assieme a Eros Bergonzoli, Emanuele Bertoli, Marco Solari e Aldo Merlini, abbiamo un po' fatto come i surrealisti. Abbiamo sognato di creare una manifestazione che facesse rinascere il Monte Verità e fungesse da luogo di incontro culturale fra il nord e il sud. Il nostro sogno è diventato realtà. E in questi anni ci ha permesso di incontrare molte persone interessanti. Posso dunque dire che sì, oggi è ancora possibile sognare. E se in Ticino, ma soprattutto nella nostra regione, è ancora possibile sognare, lo dobbiamo ad una persona che al Ticino e alla regione ha dato tantissimo. Ha portato il Festival del Film ad un livello altissimo, ha fatto nascere questi eventi letterari a Monte Verità, ora sono alla 12ª edizione, e per noi asconesi ha riportato in auge il nostro monte, il Monte Verità. Penso che sapete tutti di chi stiamo parlando e per questa ragione vi invito a fare un vigoroso applauso al nostro caro amico Marco Solari. Anche l'edizione di quest'anno si prospetta straordinariamente interessante. Come asconese mi piace mettere l'accento sulle visite guidate di domenica al Monte Verità, sperando così che sia gli asconesi che i locarnesi possano ritornare a frequentare quel magico luogo. Ringrazio però ora tutto lo staff, dal presidente Raphael Brunswick, al direttore artistico Stefan Zweifel, a Stefano Knuchel, a Maike Albat, a Carmen Werner e alle sue collaboratrici. A tutte e a tutti loro dico un grande grazie di cuore e a voi auguro in questi 4 giorni di sognare con noi e lo faccio con il titolo di una lettura che si svolgerà al Monte Verità. No al reale, sì al meraviglioso. Grazie. Andavo via prima di presentare il direttore artistico Stefan Zweifel.
Benvenuti e benvenute qui a Locarno. È un grande onore per me di ritornare al Monte Verità a Oscona quest'anno dopo l'altro anno che sono stato la prima volta qui e vediamo se il mio italiano si è un po' migliorato o no. Oggi ho fatto una piccola passeggiata al Monte Verità che è veramente magnetico. Non so, forse Marco Solari è ancora un po' più magnetico che il Monte Verità, ma sono andato un po' attraverso i fiori, attraverso gli alberi. Mi sono detto, ma dove sono i funghi? Deve essere qualche parte un fungo, dei funghi meravigliosi, monteveritaniani, non so, allucinante qualcosa. E mi sono ricordato un amico mio, Peter Weber, un autore molto, molto importante, che mi ha raccontato che è andato al cantone Giura e ha mangiato un piccolo fungo e poi un secondo piccolo fungo con un piccolino psilocibina dentro e poi ha visto dappertutto funghi, lucenti, allucinanti, dappertutto, qui un fungo, qui. E mi sono detto, forse quello è il segreto delle lettere. Quando ho letto la prima volta Friedrich Nietzsche, dopo ho visto, un altro fungo, Arthur Rimbaud, in Saison Enfer. E poi, un altro fungo, Claude Cain, un allucinante Ingeborg Bachmann. E forse tutti questi funghi insieme, in simbiosi con i lettori, noi siamo gli alberi, e con i radici, rizomatiche, sono qualcosa olistico. E io penso che anche questo libro di Merlin Sheldrake, molto fascinoso, è un po' come un fungo, lo sa anche lui, e io vi leggo un piccolo parte in tedesco, ma sarà tradotto. Tutto al fine lui scrive, e si deve mangiare i libri. Jetzt, da dieses Buch fertig ist, kann ich es den Pilzen übergeben, damit sie es auseinandernehmen. Ich werde ein Exemplar anfeuchten. Il mio è caduto nel badewanne una volta, ma boh. Ich werde ein Exemplar anfeuchten und Pleurotus mycel hineinsäen. Wenn es sich durch die Wörter, durch die Seiten und Buchdeckel gefressen hat und Austernpilze auf dem Umschlag wachsen, werde ich sie essen. Aus einem anderen Exemplar werde ich die Seiten entfernen, einstampfen und die Zellulose des Papiers mit schwacher Säure zu Zucker abbauen. Der Zuckerlösung setze ich dann Hefe zu. Nachdem sie zu Bier vergoren ist, werde ich es trinken und damit den Kreis schließen. Pilze schaffen Welten und sie bauen Welten ab. Surreale Welten, magnetische Felder. Wir sind also schon beim Titel eigentlich dieser 12. Ausgabe der Eventi Letterari Monte Verità. Und die Surrealisten nach dem Ersten Weltkrieg standen natürlich vor der Frage, was kann man vor dem Hintergrund von Krieg und Terror noch für Kunst machen, was für Kunst darf man machen. Und genauso stehen auch wir vor dem Hintergrund von Krieg und Terrorismus vor der Frage, was kann Kunst, was darf Kunst? Darf sie noch das freie Spiel der Fantasie ausüben oder muss sie sich ideologisch einreihen? Nun, die Dadaisten während des Ersten Weltkrieges und die Surrealisten nach dem Ersten Weltkrieg haben ganz verschiedene Antworten gefunden. Die Dadaisten haben das radikale Nein vertreten, die Surrealisten ein neues radikales Ja. Die Dadaisten in Zürich, ein paar Deutsche, ein paar Rumänen, vielleicht war auch mal ein Zürcher dabei, haben ein Kabarett gegründet mit dem Namen Voltaire, der Franzosen, um gegen den Nationalismus des Krieges zu sein. Aber sie waren auch gegen Voltaire als Aufklärer, der an die Vernunft geglaubt hat, an die technische Vernunft, an jene Vernunft, die den Krieg erst möglich machte. Zunächst sagten sie einfach Nein zum Krieg, im klassischen Sinn des Kabarets. Dann gingen sie einen Schritt weiter und sagten Nein zur klassischen bourgeoisen Kultur, zu Voltaire, zu Goethe, zu den Dichtern, die von den Soldaten in den Tornistern in die Schlacht getragen wurden. Sie sagten, genau diese Kultur hat einen solchen Krieg eben nicht verunmöglicht. Wir wollen eine andere Kultur, Lautréamont, Rimbaud, Jarry. Und dann merken Sie, dieses Nein ist auch noch nicht genug. Wir müssen Nein sagen zur Sprache. Die Sprache selber ist ein Träger von Macht und Hierarchie. Jeder Satz ist ein solches Beispiel. Es gibt immer ein Ich, ein Subjekt, selbstherrlich wie der deutsche Kaiser. Und es schickt mit seinen Verben als Befehle die Objekte wie Soldaten in die Schützengräben der Syntax und der Grammatik. Deshalb stellte sich Hugo Ball hin, 1917, und hat 3 Lautgedichte vorgetragen, um die Sprache in ihre Grundstücke zu zerschlagen. Jolifanto, baubla, ofalibambla, grosiga, mpfa, habla horem, egiga, goramen, holoka, holala, anlogobung, bosso fataka, ü, champavula, wusa, olobo. Tumba, ba umf, kusagauma, ba umf, anlogobum. Er war im Gegensatz zu mir wirklich nervös und schwitzte und wurde in einem seltsamen Kostüm, das er anhatte, wie ein Priester, hinter die Bühne getragen. Denn er hatte während des Vortrags so Angst gehabt, dass er in den Singsang der Kirchenlitanei fiel, um Halt zu haben. Er hat sein eigenes Ich verloren. Er hat nicht nur Nein zur Sprache gesagt, Nein zum Krieg, sondern Nein zum eigenen Ich. Und da flüchtete er an den Monte Verita, um sich selber wieder zu finden, und er fand sich und den Halt im lieben Gott, im Katholizismus. Und da haben natürlich die Surrealisten in Paris nicht mitgemacht. Nein, die Surrealisten sind von da ausgegangen, aber in eine andere Richtung. Sie wollten ein neues Ja, ein Ja zum Wunderbaren, ein Ja zum Leben, ein Ja zum Leben in der Stadt. Sie wollten das Unbewusste erforschen, die Träume, sie haben sich in Hypnose versetzen lassen, in der Écriture automatique so schnell geschrieben, dass sie nicht mehr mitdenken konnten. Das Diktat der Vernunft haben sie abgeschafft für den Traum, das Unbewusste und den Zufall. Sie sind durch Paris, durch die Passagen, wie durch einen Film von Buñuel und haben mit den Augen geklimpert und jedes Klimpern war ein Schnitt und sie haben ein neues, wunderbares Collage-Mysterium entdeckt. Oder in den Nächten draußen in den Banlieues, in den Parks, in den Friedhöfen, dort, wo sich die Liebenden küssen. Und sie merken, dass ihr Ich sich auflöst, nicht nur im Traum. Das Ich löst sich nicht nur in der Hypnose auf, nicht nur in der Erotik zwischen den Kissenfalten, sondern eben auch bei einem Gang durch die Stadt. Sie merkten, die eigene Psyche löst sich auf, ist in Korrespondenz mit den Häusern, so wie die Pilze mit den Bäumen. Sie hätten großen Spaß, großes Interesse an diesem Buch von Merlin Sheldrake und natürlich auch an ihm selber gehabt. Denn er hat sich ja zum Beispiel mit LSD in die Vorstellung des Pilzes selber hineinversetzt, wie das so ist, wenn man selber ein psilocybiner Pilz wirkt. Oder hat sich in eine Badewanne gelegt, wo Pilze Holzspäne auffressen und gären und hat sich sozusagen selber fermentieren lassen. Und er schreibt immer wieder, wie könnten wir, um die Pilze zu verstehen, die Bäume und die Wurzeln, eine andere Sprache finden? Eine Sprache vielleicht, wie sie die Surrealisten suchten, wo das Ich nicht einfach ein Ich ist, sondern ein Wir und sich auflöst. Wie die Flechten, schreibt er einmal, sie sind Subjekt und Verb zugleich. Gibt es eine solche Sprache? Wir werden es herausfinden. Unsere Gäste, unsere Autoren und Autorinnen haben das immer wieder versucht. Marion Poschmann, die am Samstag liest, hat im Gedichtband Nimbus bereits eine Antwort gefunden, wie man über Klima, Bäume, Farne, Sträucher schreiben kann. Wir werden ganz viele Stimmen hören. Tom McCarthy ist hier, dessen Bücher immer auch Schweifzüge in Philosophie und Wissenschaft sind. Ann Cotton, die ganz verrückte Gedichte vortragen wird und uns über Regeln und Regelbruch, über KI und den Zufall etwas verraten wird. Raoul Schrott, der letzte Sekretär des letzten Surrealisten Philippe Soupeau, wird uns das Wesen der Dichtung selber erschließen. Michael Lenz ist gerade angekommen mit seinem Saxophon, um Lautgedichte vorzutragen und dazu Saxophon zu spielen. Und am Schluss wird mein Freund Jojo Meyer mit dem Schlagzeug zeigen, wie man mit Algorithmen ganz anders umgehen kann als in der Endlosschleife der Unterhaltung. Es kommen natürlich auch noch viele andere Gäste. Ich habe jetzt nicht alle aufgezählt. Morgen Abend Katie Fusco, auch mit Michael Lenz, Raoul Schrott für Lautgedichte. Was für eine Sprache könnten wir noch erfinden? Nun, als ich das letzte Mal nach dem Monte Veritas 6 Kilo leichter, die Hosen sind immer noch etwas weit, nach Zürich zurückgekommen bin, war meine Tochter ganz traurig. Sie hat mir irgendeine Geschichte erzählt. Ich habe die absurderweise in ein Buch über Terrorismus notiert. Papa, Mama, Papa, Pepe. Dada me, no me, dami, agua. Miam nam nam emme. Ishta. Det. Mono. Nai baby. Ah ja boy. Ui. Bitte. Bett. In diesem Sinn hat jetzt meine Tochter Fleur die 12. Eventi Letterari Monte Verità eröffnet und ich freue mich auf das Gespräch von Merlin Sheldrake und Sandra Sain. Vielen Dank.
Buonasera. Beh sì, siete tante, siete tanti, anche questa sera. Allora, innanzitutto è un piacere per me essere qui. Ringrazio l'organizzazione degli eventi letterari per avermi coinvolta anche in questa edizione e in questa serata in particolare con Merlin Sheldrake. È un piacere vedervi così numerosi, perché poi è prova, no, della curiosità e dell'interesse che il lavoro di Merlin Sheldrake ha saputo risvegliare, e anche direi non incidentalmente, insomma, della capacità di questa manifestazione degli eventi letterari di intercettare quei temi, quelle personalità che poi davvero hanno la capacità di incidere sul contemporaneo, sulla nostra prospettiva, sul nostro sguardo sul mondo, sulla vita, o forse potremmo dire anche sulle vite e sul futuro. Merlin Sheldrake, è un grande piacere essere qui con te questa sera sul palco. It's a really great pleasure for me to be here with you on stage tonight. Mi scuserete se mi permetto di dare del tu, vero? Non sono abituata a farlo, non è mia consuetudine, ma al di là di una questione anagrafica non posso vantare gli stessi anni di Merlin, però diciamo che tutti e due siamo ancora relativamente, spero, lontani dai reumatismi e dalla pensione, purtroppo per fortuna. Però mi permetto di dargli del tu perché questa sera faremo un po' di ginnastica linguistica, diciamo così, nel senso che adesso facciamo queste introduzioni in italiano, poi la nostra conversazione avverrà per lo più in inglese, e l'inglese, come sapete, è una lingua più friendly, più sportiva, per rimanere nella metafora che si dà sempre del tu, e quindi mi sembrava coerente in questo senso usarlo anche in italiano. Tra l'altro ci tengo subito a ringraziare le interpreti, per chi di voi insomma sta usando le cuffie, che sono sempre bravissime, questa sera lo saranno ancora di più, e vi prego di essere clementi perché io non sono madrelingua inglese, insomma, quindi farò del mio meglio, abbiate pietà. Venendo a noi. Allora, il libro dal quale prende spunto la nostra conversazione, ne parlava già prima un po' Stefan Schweifel, è un libro che ha per titolo in italiano L'ordine nascosto, Entangled Life, in inglese. Non è un romanzo, non è letteratura, è un saggio di taglio scientifico, scritto da un biologo specializzato in funghi, che generalmente non sembrerebbe proprio il presupposto per un grande successo editoriale. E invece in questo caso lo è. Allora, come mai? Questo è un po' quello che cercheremo di capire questa sera. Dal mio punto di vista, uno degli elementi chiave di questo lavoro e di questo libro è che è un libro, certo, scientificamente robusto, molto solido, ma non è una mera analisi fenomenologica di un mondo a noi sconosciuto come quello dei funghi. È un libro che mostra una cultura estremamente ampia, interdisciplinare, che spazia, che può parlare veramente di tante cose, e muovendosi da un ambito all'altro. Ci sono dei momenti in cui può essere anche molto divertente e dei momenti in cui non manca di slancio poetico. E quindi il mio obiettivo questa sera, la mia speranza è che al termine di questa nostra conversazione possiate uscire da questa sala con la sensazione e l'emozione che ho avuto io nel leggere questo libro, e che hanno avuto, penso, le tante persone che l'hanno già letto. Cioè la sensazione di trovarsi davvero di fronte a una finestra spalancata su un mondo nuovo, un mondo verde, un mondo rigoglioso, un mondo vastissimo e intimo al contempo. Cominciamo dall'inizio. Allora, so Merlin, let's start from the beginning. Let's start from the fungi and what drew you at first into the world of fungi.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your words. I'm sure they were very kind. I didn't understand anything. Otherwise, I'd be very embarrassed, I'm sure. I wish I could always not understand introductions. Thank you all for coming. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be here at this opening moment. It's an honor to be here at the closing moment for Mr. Mayor at this edition of the festival. Fungi, what drew me to fungi? Well, one of the first times I learned about fungi was when I was a child, and I grew up the son of a biologist, and so I was encouraged to take an interest in the many lives unfolding around me. I was encouraged to go outside and to ask questions. And so one of the things that I became curious about was I would carry buckets of kitchen waste from the kitchen, like banana peel, orange skins, apple cores. I would take these, I would put them on the compost heap in the garden. And then several months later, I would shovel out with my dad what had become soil and put it on beds in the garden, the flower beds. And I wondered how it was that these orange peels and banana skins and apple cores could turn into soil. How could stuff transform from one state into another state? It seemed like a miracle, and actually it still does seem like a miracle. The more I think about this, the more astonishing it becomes. But this was decomposition, what we call decomposition. And so I asked how this happened. How was this going on? My dad explained that it was because fungi and other small organisms, like bacteria, transformed stuff from one state into another. And I was excited about this because it seemed like they had a great power. This was a great power. But if they were so powerful, why couldn't I see them? Powerful to me as a child meant big. It meant big, like dinosaurs or whales, or like storms, or waves in the ocean. It didn't mean invisibly small. And this really was a big moment for me, and that opened the door to the world of the subvisible. And from then on, it's been a slippery slope, and I just become more and more interested in fungi. The more I learn, the more I want to find out. But one of the things that keeps happening, and I think this is relevant to this theme of surrealism, is that thinking about fungi makes the world look different, and fungi can make the familiar seem unfamiliar again. And for me, this is something that pulls me back to fungi again and again. That the familiar can become unfamiliar once again, that I can be drawn into an innocent engagement and see what is in front of me rather than what I'm expected to see. So fungi confound my expectations, fungi confuse me, fungi invite me into mystery, into unanswered questions. And for this, I'm endlessly grateful.
So you see, as a child, Merlin Sheldrake didn't play with Superman, Batman, Wolverine. He played with the superpower of fungi. And what's interesting also is that I discovered it reading your book, is that fungi are a kingdom of life. And it may sound surprising to us, even if we live in a region, in a state, which is a great culture of fungi, of mushrooms in reality, but generally we don't know that it is a kingdom of life. But you tell us that it is defined as such since the 60s. But I can assure you I went to school after the 60s, but they didn't tell me that. So, what are fungi? And how can we describe them? Because we are starting to, discover things which are quite fascinating and surprising.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as you say, they're a kingdom of life. So that's as broad and busy a category as animals or plants. Think about all the ways there are to be an animal, from a flea to a whale. Think about all the ways there are to be a plant, from a geranium to a redwood sequoia. There are many, many ways to be a fungus. This is a broad category. When we think of fungi, we normally think of mushrooms, as you say. But mushrooms are just a small part of fungal life. Mushrooms are just the reproductive structures of fungi, analogous to apples on an apple tree. Most fungi live most of their lives not as mushrooms, but as branching, fusing networks of tubular cells called mycelial networks. So fungi live their life in this network form. And animals tend to find food in the world and put it inside their bodies. Fungi use these networks to put their bodies inside their food. They do it the other way around. And so they do so by these networks, they grow from their tips. And they burrow into whatever they're eating. They branch around in whatever they're eating, insinuating themselves into their food, and then they digest it from the inside. So much of fungal life happens out of our sight because they're burrowed inside their food. So this is often what we'll be talking about when we're talking about fungi. These are mycelial networks that are constantly remodeling themselves. They are able to solve problems without having a brain. They're able to coordinate flows within their networks without having a heart. And they're able to integrate all sorts of sensory information from their surroundings to decide in their way on the best course of action. They're astonishing creatures that confound much of what we think of what it means to be alive.
We're talking about funghi, una piccola annotazione linguistica, l'avrete già capito, qui l'italiano e l'inglese non viaggiano di pari passo perché in inglese il termine funghi comprende questa rete che è il mycelium, no? Il micelio, e comprende anche i funghi che sono invece i mushrooms, quindi c'è una differenza insomma linguistica, ma credo che Merlin abbia benissimo spiegato, no? Che cosa c'è dentro ogni termine. Merlin, about this network, in your book there's this expression which is really incisive and at the same time evocative to describe it, which refers and plays with the World Wide Web, and it is the Wood Wide Web. So is it correct? Because I listened to some interviews in which you pointed out and wanted to highlight the differences between a web as we think about when we think about the World Wide Web and the network of the mycelium.
Yeah, I think it's a powerful metaphor, and it's vivid. It conjures in our minds social networks. It conjures in our minds the power of what it means to connect up organisms in the form of networks. So it's helpful in conjuring to mind in one quick way the power of these fungal networks to change the ecologies that they live in. And so I think for that reason it's helpful. But for me, I always find machine metaphors a little problematic. When we turn the living world into machines, I think we do it in injustice. I also think it's anthropocentric because humans are the only organisms to make machines. So what the Wood Wide Web for me is a bit of a mechanistic metaphor, but the bigger problem I have with it is that it makes the fungi into the cables in the network. The Wood Wide Web is what's used to describe plants that are connected together with a single fungal network. But the image that it brings to mind is of plants as, say, the routers in the internet or the hubs in the World Wide Web. And it makes the fungi into the connecting, passive connectors, the wires. And for me, fungi are very active. They are agents of their own life, and they shape their own evolutionary trajectories, and they have many different ways that they are very active in the story. So that's the main reason why I think that metaphor runs out of road.
So you talked about the fascination you feel for fungi because they make us change our perspectives in many ways, and they also challenge our categories, we could say, in a certain sense. And we have said that they have been, in a certain sense, discriminated by universities and academies. Maybe we return to that. We return and go back to that theme later. But when we say that they challenge our categories, you just already gave us an idea of how, saying that they need food like animals, in a sense that they don't produce their own food like plants do. And when we think about mushrooms, I'm sure that we generally think about them as plants. But they are more like animals because they find food outside of themselves, but at the same time they don't move, they don't locomote, and they grow around like plants. So by doing this, and by doing many other things that we'll explore, I hope, they challenge our categories of individuality, autonomy, and intelligence. So I wanted to start with you from taking into consideration individuality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's good to think about these categories and the way that they challenge them. You know, I was thinking when we were talking about hearing about this surrealism earlier, I love this story about Alfred Jarry, the surrealist, and he was very short, and he was made to join the army, and the army did not make uniforms that were small enough for him. So he just wore. No, he hated being in the army, but he wore the uniform, the smallest size of the uniform, but it came down over his arms and over his feet. And so he managed to leave the army, get expelled from the army by, on the parade ground, doing exactly what people said to do, what the parade master said to do. But because he did it with this absurd uniform that was too big for him, all the other soldiers just burst out laughing. They could not stop laughing. And so he was considered so disruptive to the order, to the categories of order, that he was sent home, which is exactly what he wanted, just by following orders. And so I think about this, you know, with when we try to force things into categories and they don't fit, and fungi do this all the time. So individuality, you know, we live in societies and cultures that are depend on neatly identifiable individuals. We have passports, we have tax returns, we have, and a lot of our rights and our privileges, hard-won privileges, depend on our individual sovereignty, and that's all very important and all very well. But the thing is, when you study the living world from the perspective of a biologist, it's not always clear where the boundaries between individuals should be drawn. We contain more microbes than our own cells, without which we wouldn't grow and reproduce as we do. And all organisms are living in these intricate and intimate symbiotic relationships. Fungi make this very clear. So let's imagine if you have a fungal network, we could be growing this on a dish in a lab, and you could have a single fungus there. It would grow outwards in a kind of fluffy white circle as it explored its surroundings. You could take a fragment of that network, put it somewhere else in another dish, and it would grow into another fluffy white circle. You could take another fragment. You could make 20 or 30 of these different, they would look like different individuals. They're growing in separate lives in separate places. But then you could take, at a later date, all of those cultures and put them back next to each other, and they would fuse and form one continuous network. And so is this now this new network, is that the same individual as it was? Is it a different individual? This is the kind of question that fungi pose for us. They make it very clear that all life is in fact intricate, shimmering networks of interrelation. The boundaries between individuals are fluid and often confusing. So this is one of the ways that they invite us to think in new ways about what it means to be a self, what it means to be an individual. If we are an individual, we are a composite individual. But then again, our bacteria can have smaller bacteria living inside them. Even large viruses can have smaller viruses existing within them. It is relationship all the way down. But yeah, fungi make this clear.
Well, you were talking about symbiosis, and fungi seem to be the perfect example of it, in fact. They constantly live a symbiotic relation with plants, and so I wondered, is it possible that all forms of life symbiotically live together, and that we haven't considered it that much important till nowadays, and that fungi are drawing our attention to symbiosis as a much more widespread phenomenon than we thought it was?
I think that's right. Fungi have a role to play there, but all organisms are like this. You know, fungi just make it extra clear for us. And I think this is really one of the things that is changing in these times. You know, there's been people in the biological sciences who've been emphasizing the symbiotic nature of life since the late 19th century, but it remained, at least within Anglophone science, at the margins of polite biological society, because for the most part, the neo-Darwinian orthodoxy liked to emphasize competition. And you saw in the picture of the living world, the fierce, competitive conflicts that you found in a Victorian industrialist, capitalist culture, mirrored back to us in the fierce dog-eat-dog, nature's red in tooth and claw, this version of the living world. But in recent years, it's become clear that that's a part of the story, but not the whole story, and that life is relationship, as I say. And this, in some ways, is news to many people today, at least within modern scientific cultures. But I think this is something that humans have long known in traditional societies and ancestral knowledge systems. So in some way, I think about it as a kind of remembering something that we've forgotten. Because I think for most humans, over most of human history, it was intuitively clear and abundantly materially clear that we live in intimate, reciprocal dependence with the living world, as does every other being in the living world. So this is a big and overdue turn in the modern sciences, and happy it's happening.
So we talked about individuality. I would love to talk about intelligence. I think we could describe intelligence as the ability to solve problems. Well, I read it in your book. As the ability to solve problems, to adapt to changes, and to make decisions. So, can we really say that fungi are intelligent?
I'm bound to say yes. But I do think so. And I think there are ways that, we think of intelligence as something that humans have. But it's really something that humans do. Intelligence depends on our actions. And intelligence really depends on our actions in relation to other organisms, other humans, to a changing environment. So when we think about intelligence in terms of actions, in terms of behaviors, processes, then it becomes clear that there are lots of different ways of showing intelligent behaviors, and it usually involves the ability to solve problems, the ability to adapt to meet a changing world, the ability to make decisions between alternatives. And fungi do all of these, and in actual fact, all organisms do these in varying degrees. To be alive is to have evolved, and to evolve is to have, by trial and error in a very long time, find ways to rise to the challenge of living. And all organisms have different challenges and have risen to meet those challenges in different ways. So intelligence might look very different for a fungus than it might do for a human. But what's fun with fungi is when you give them tasks that humans would consider a challenge. So one of the classic examples is a labyrinth. Fungi are able to find the shortest path between the entrance and the exit of a maze or a labyrinth. And so researchers give them little mazes, and you unleash the fungus and it goes in. But unlike a human, when we get to a forked path, we have to choose right or left. The fungus just branches and takes both routes and keeps doing that. And eventually it works, gets to the exit, and then it just prunes back the unnecessary links to leave the shortest path. So they're brilliant spatial problem solvers. These are challenges that we would recognize as intelligence tests. I have a friend who studies slime molds, and which aren't true fungi, but they live their lives as networks, like fungi do. And he's a scientist, and he's an artist as well. And he does this. He did this wonderful experiment. He said, "Merlin, I always get lost in IKEA stores. They're so confusing, and I can never get out of there without asking someone to help me get out of there. So I thought that I would make a maze based on the floor plan of my local IKEA, and then I'll release the slime molds into the slime mold-sized IKEA to scale, perfect, and see how they get out." And he said, sure enough, give them a few hours, they found the way out. They didn't need to ask anyone. They're smarter than me. And I love this. This way of this leveling the playing field. And the way to think about intelligence is there's different ways to express intelligence. So fungi do that, and what's more, they do all of that without a brain, which makes it extra confusing for us.
Mm-hmm. And you see, when I said before that reading your book can be also very, very funny, it's because when you read this experiment, well, I felt really sympathetic with your colleague, and I envied the fungi of the experiment, because I also get lost always in the IKEA or wherever you put me. I get lost. But you said, and I would love to explore a little bit more this idea that they can be intelligent without having a brain. Isn't that a great challenge for you as researcher, to understand how is it that they communicate, that they send messages, that they make decisions, in fact? Where's their brain if there's none?
Well, they don't have one. But there has to be somewhere where information is integrated. A fungal network might be, it might stretch over 10 meters. It might be connected to the roots of 5 different plants, in trading relationships with 3 or 4 million different root tips, exposed to quite different circumstances in different parts of this network, and it's somehow able to stay in touch with itself. It's able to, in its way, be aware of what's going on in a different part of itself. And by integrating this sensory information, by sending sensory information around itself on a timescale which is relevant to the problems it's having to solve. So it's really a remarkable thing. But one way to think about it, perhaps, that makes it a little easier is that we contain electrically excitable networks of cells within our body, which we use for learning and problem solving. When we call it our nervous system, which culminates in our brain. And so fungi don't contain flexible networks of information-carrying cells. They are flexible networks of information-carrying cells. And so maybe we can think about it almost like a kind of inside-out a brain, a way of them turning this way of being the other way around.
So fungi are among the first forms of life on Earth, and they are in a certain sense inseparable from plant life, from mycelium, this network you're talking about. So can we say that fungi have been and are fundamental for the development of life and our ecosystem as we know it?
Absolutely. It wouldn't be an exaggeration. And if you cast your mind back to around 500 million years ago, and you were on land, what you would see is a rocky, dry, dusty place, scorched with temperature fluctuations, very high levels of CO2. It's not an easy place to live on land, but in the water, there's all sorts of activity going on. There are 9-foot-long sea scorpions along the sea floor. There are mollusks are thriving. Corals are starting to form reefs. There's all sorts of activity. So what started to happen, what transformed life on land from this barren place to a habitable place, is largely to do with the evolution of plants, land plants, which have gone on to change completely the biosphere. And this journey of plants from the water onto the land was only possible with the help of fungi. So the ancestors of land plants were algae, which are a bit like seaweeds, living in fresh waters, in ponds and lakes and rivers. And over time, these algae started to wash up onto the soggy shores of lakes and rivers. And when they got to these soggy shores, they were faced with all sorts of new challenges. When they lived in the water, they're floating in a nutrient soup. They don't have to seek nutrients. But on land, they've got to navigate this complex, hostile place, the soil. It's like a multidimensional labyrinth. It's a very, very challenging place to explore, to try and find the nutrients they need. So at that point, they struck up a relationship with fungi, which, because of their branching and their fusing, because of their ability to solve spatial problems, because of their chemical wizardry, are able to forage in the soil and scavenge these nutrients and able to trade those, exchange them with their algal partners for energy containing carbon compounds like sugars or lipids that the algae had made in photosynthesis. So this ancient trading relationship begins there, potentially even before. But this meant that fungi were plant root systems. They were behaving as plant root systems for tens of millions of years before plants evolved roots. And so what this means is that plant and fungal relationships are a more fundamental part of planthood than lots of things that we think of as really planty traits, like leaves and flowers and wood and fruits. That these relationships really enabled this journey of algae onto the land. They enabled the evolution of land plants, and they enabled everything that was to follow. And so we are the inheritors of this transformation of biological possibility that all happened because of this coming together and staying together of unlike organisms.
Why have universities and academies neglected fungi and this field of study and research so much?
Well, part of it is no one's fault. It was only in the 60s, as you say, that they won their independence and became thought of as their own kingdom of life. And before that, they were thought of as lower plants, which is not a very glamorous place to be. And indeed, they were studied in dusty and unfashionable corners of botany departments around the world. And And there they languish, and so as soon as they're a kingdom of life, then they're deserving a kingdom's worth of attention, and so on. But that was only very recently. So we're living in a world where this disciplinary bias is still entrenched. There hasn't been that much time for university departments and professorships and students and grant-awarding bodies to arise to subsidize and enable fungal research. But there are other reasons, I think, as well. Fungi are weird. They're deeply confusing, and they're weird, and they're difficult to reach. They live their life out of our reach, immersed in whatever they're eating. And even today, with, say, as much research money as you want, all the team and equipment and possibilities you could want, there's still things that we just can't access. Like, we still can't see material flowing through fungal networks outside in the wild, wet world of the soil. It's very difficult to know this. So I think that difficulty has played a part as well. It's hard to study them, and then when we do start studying them, then we're confused. And so I think that has also played a part.
So I'll go back to the question of the brain. Giorgio Vallortigara, he's an Italian neuroscientist. He is also part of this edition of the Eventi Letterari. I think you met him. And he's the head of the Department of Animal Brain and Cognition in an important Italian university. He has published many fascinating studies and books on the subject of the brain of animals, insects, and I recommend to read I pensieri della mosca con la testa storta, è un libro davvero meraviglioso. He questions in that book, but not only, our idea that insects, for example, are intelligent, but not only that they may have a conscience. Now it depends on what we mean by conscience, but they have a conscience. And what is interesting is that he says, and he points out, it's nothing new age. He's a famous scientist, neuroscientist. He points out that intelligence goes with a certain level, degree of conscience. And I was thinking that getting to know a little bit of your family, of your studies, reading your book, that maybe you could agree with this idea.
I think so, yes. I think about experience and the way that different organisms are amplifiers of experience, complex amplifiers of experience. And we're very complex amplifiers of experience, but it doesn't mean that we're the only amplifiers of experience or the only complex amplifiers of experience. So I do think about what it must be like for a fungus, which is a sensing body. It is responsive. It is not behaving like a pre-programmed robot. And so I think about these fungi in dancing with the circumstance, interacting in fantastically complex ways with communities of organisms, some vast and some tiny. From viruses to redwood sequoias, a fungus will be interacting across these scales. Sensing, responding, integrating information. I think about what kind of complex amplifier experience this fungus could be. And of course, it's no way for us to know. You have to ask them. But and it's difficult to even know, what it's like for another human, even if you can share the same language. So this is a question that I do wonder about.
The subheading of your book is how fungi make our worlds, change our minds, and shape our futures. So let's look a little bit to the future and how fungi shape our future or futures, because you use the plural.
Yes, so fungi have shaped, as I said, they've shaped our past. They've shaped the pasts of all organisms that are alive today in the way that they make soil, that they enable life on land, they regulate the composition of the atmosphere through their metabolisms, all these ways and more. And so, of course, they will shape our futures, because our futures are conditioned by not only our decisions and the decisions of other humans, but the actions and the ways that all the creatures alive today respond to a changing environment. And fungi are, they've seen a lot they've been through 5 major extinction events, and lots of fungi were made extinct in these events, but lots of fungi thrived in these calamitous and catastrophic circumstances, and were able to survive by being flexible and by being collaborative, and by being able to solve all sorts of problems. So in the future, the kind of planet that we will be living on in 5 years, 20 years, 500 years, 5,000 years, maybe we won't be living on the planet in 5,000 years, or even 500 years, who knows. But everything about the futures will be conditioned by fungi and fungal activity, and in part by the way that we choose to partner with fungi, to adapt to many of the crises that we face. And there are lots of ways that we can partner with fungi to help solve problems, many of which we've created for ourselves.
So we know that fungi can be used and are used nowadays, in fact, for fabrics, for new kinds of building materials, for their curative effects. I didn't know that researchers are working on the development of fungal computers. Can you tell us something more about it?
Yeah, I mean, the basic idea is that these are information processing networks that have evolved for 500, over 1 billion years to solve problems. And so if we could somehow pick up the information traveling through a fungal network and decode it into a form that was meaningful for us humans, it would tell us something. It might tell us the outcome of these sensory feats that the fungi are performing all the time. And so that's one way to think about it, is that by being able to detect what's going on in a fungus and to try and decode this, we will be considering it to be a problem-solving creature, computing solutions to complex problems, and that we could then understand what the outcomes of those computations were. Another way to think about it is that fungi are really good, as I've said, at solving spatial problems like labyrinths and mazes. And there are some mathematical issues that we can, or challenges that we can encode spatially. You could program a problem in spatial terms, in terms of the branches in a maze. And if you can put a problem into spatial terms, then you can release a fungus through that maze, and you'll get a solution from the fungus. So that's another way to think about it.
So I have studied humanities, I've studied literature in particular, and after reading your book, I wondered if I had ever met this subject in my studies, and how many times had I met fungi in my readings. And the first thing that came to my mind was the caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland, because it lives on a mushroom, but others I couldn't remember. So I did a little bit of research and started from the Bible. And in the Bible, fungi are always spoken of as a problem because infections and illnesses. Then looking at literature, romantic poets used quite a bit of fungal metaphors in their works, but they were used as a synonym of decay and rottenness, for example, in the verses of Shelley and Keats, not of Coleridge. He was always a little bit aside, not a part of the group. They were used in the verses of Emily Dickinson as well. Then there's the chapter of science fiction. And so you find fungi in H.G. Wells, in Ray Bradbury, and they're menacing figures. Then there's Molière. He's interested in Molière. He had an estate, and he named his estate Périgord, from the name of a region famous for its exquisite black truffles. But when he had to write a comedy and a very negative character, his name was Tartuffe. So, you told us before that fungi received positive attention in past times, traditions. For example, in pre-Columbian cultures, there are statues anthropomorphic fungi or something like that. But I was wondering if there's an artistic, literary version, portrayal of fungi that, I don't know if it is correct, that has influenced you or simply that you like.
It's such a good analysis. Thank you. That's an amazing tour of, and it's so right. You know, it's like fungi. There's so many of the stories about fungi are to do with death and decay and disease. But there's a secret history of fungi that hides plainly within our sight. And so, if we go back to the Bible, there's also wine. There's a lot of wine, and very important wine in the Bible, and that's made by a fungus. That's fermented by a yeast. There's bread. That's also made by a fungus, fermented by a yeast. And there are plants, and all plants are in intimate relationships with fungi. When we cultivate a plant, we're cultivating fungal relationships. When we eat a plant, we are eating fungi too. And so I think about the secret history of fungi as involving any part of literature where plants are discussed, as being a cryptic discussion of what fungi can do and the ways they're able to enable life. But that maybe it's cheating a little bit.
So we heard Stefan before referring to an experiment to which you participated with psychedelic mushrooms, and talking about pre-Columbian cultures. They knew the potentialities and the qualities of mushrooms in this with their curative effects, but not only psychedelic effects. And when we talk about psychedelic mushrooms, some of us, they raise their brows, some others just smile and laugh a little bit. But can you tell us what kind of experiment was it for you?
So the experiment was actually, in that case, it was LSD rather than mushrooms, although similar experiments have been done with mushrooms. And LSD, appropriately here we're in Switzerland, was isolated by Albert Hoffman, from compounds that he'd extracted from fungi. So this LSD arrived in human life via fungi. So this experiment was, I was researching in the Department of Plant Sciences at Cambridge, and in the cafeteria, there was a poster on the wall that said, "Do you have a meaningful problem that needs solving?" And so I thought, yes, I've got so many. What can you do for me? I just responded exactly how they wanted me to respond. He said, "If so, call this number." So I called the number. It's like, yeah, I've got meaningful problems. What you got to say? And they said, well, we're recruiting subjects for an LSD study. We're recruiting scientists and mathematicians, and we want to get scientists and mathematicians and put them in a hospital room. We'll give them lots of LSD, big dose, and see if the psychedelic experience helps them solve problems. And I said, great, sign me up. So after I was vetted carefully. It was all done very responsibly in a clinical drug testing unit, the wing of a hospital. And so I showed up for my session, and I had a room where I was, and there was a mathematician. He had his own room next door, and the researchers had been really considerate, because being in a hospital isn't perhaps where you choose to spend several hours tripping on LSD. And so they put hangings on the wall, they had mood music, they had dim lights. I felt fairly comfortable, but you could still tell it was a hospital room. It was like a funny joke of this. So then they gave us the LSD, and then I was enjoying this experience. And at some point, the nurse said, "Merlin, it might now be time to start thinking about your work-related problems." So I was like, okay, fair enough. You've given me a good experience. I really need to show up for the study here. I need to really do my best. And so I went to sit down at a desk, where they gave us a desk with pens and pencils and lined paper and squared paper and every kind of erasers and anything you could possibly need to solve a scientific problem. And so I sat down there, and then I realized that actually, no, this is not where I want to be at all. It all became quite funny. There's like, wait, I'm just going to sit here and solve my problems? What, with lined paper and square? I went back to bed. And I assured my assistant that I was working on the problem. But I had a very vivid experience. I ended up in this sort of fantastical world, which felt like the soil, and it was all very vivid and remarkable. But the takeaway message for me was that I so often thought about fungi and the fungal lives that I was interacting with in a kind of schematic way, like they're kind of pre-programmed robots, automata, responding automatically to their changes in their environment. But in this experience, I was just awakened to how wild life in the soil is. What a confusing place this is, overflowing with life. A quarter of all species alive today live underground. And so I had this vivid experience. So, of course, what I had in my experience it probably bears no relation to what's actually going on in the soil. But for me, just to take on board that the soil was a busy place, frothing with life, that changed the way that I was dealing with my questions and my experiments and went about doing my science. Of course, I was helping them to do their science too, the researchers, and they had a very difficult task. So they had to come in and they had to work out how high we were. Like they're taking blood samples and stuff, but they can't. That tells you how much LSD there is in your blood. It doesn't tell you how high you are. And that's the point, is to work out what's going on in the subjectivity of these scientists when they're high. So we had to do this questionnaire every few minutes, again and again and again. And one of the questions, there was on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you rate your experience of infinity?
Ooh.
So the first time I was confronted with this question, I started laughing. Laughter was a side effect of LSD. I'd been warned in a risk assessment. Imagine the second time, same question. Third time, fourth time. By the end of the day, this question would they just came over with this clipboard with the question on it, and I just dissolved into a useless pile of whirring junk. So anyway, it was an interesting experience, a brave study, and exactly the kind of work that I think is very fascinating right now when we're coming to terms with the power of psychedelics to change the way that we experience our minds.
We think of artists as weird persons, but you scientists, But I think one of the great merits of your work, of your book, but not only, is that in fact you're drawing attention to this field of research, you're opening our eyes on this kingdom of life. And there's also a movie. There's also a documentary, a 3D documentary, and in a time of great crisis for cinemas, after the pandemic, because of the platforms also. This documentary has been released and is successfully has been in cinemas in London and in the US, if I'm right. And the title is Fungi, the Web of Life. And you have a colleague who is extraordinary in this movie, because there's the voice narrating instead of Björk, the singer. And in this documentary, they follow you in Tasmania on a quest to find an incredibly rare blue mushroom. So how was it to become the star of a movie, of a documentary, to work with such a great artist as Björk is?
Well, I had to go to Australia, and I had some of the most beautiful forests in the world, with a fascinating and fun-loving and talented production team. And I had to walk around these beautiful places, gazing at mushrooms, trying very hard to look like I was having thoughts. I felt like I had an easy time of it.
So, I wanted to explore a little bit more the link between science and art. And maybe it's a coincidence, maybe not. A few days ago, a very interesting exhibition opened in Bellinzona, a town nearby, in the Museo Villa dei Cedri. The title is Underground, Ecosistemi da esplorare, ecosystems to be explored. And mycelium plays a very important role in it, because it's at the center of different works of art, photography, for example, but not only, and also because the different artists that participate to this exhibition explore the way in which we could learn new artistic and cooperative approaches from it to society, to our life and community, etc. So I wondered if you feel that something is really changing now.
I think things are definitely changing. There's been a huge interest in fungi and in the soil, in below ground organisms, in microbes in general. And this is a real change in perspective, because when you start studying fungi and bacteria and soil communities and microbiomes, you end up in a symbiotic view of life, as we've discussed. And that's quite a different picture to a picture of neatly individualized humans somehow severed, miraculously severed from this bustling living world, existing autonomously in our exaggeratedly separated selves. So I think things are changing in lots of ways. I've been really amazed to see how much fungi are inspiring artists of all sorts, and what powerful things they have to teach us about, not just if you're somebody who works with the soil, not just if you're someone who cultivates plants or grows food, but also they can teach us about the way we imagine, the way we think, the way we feel. And I think that's one of the reasons why artists have been so curious about fungal life.
You play piano, you studied piano, you play accordion as well, don't you? Mm-hmm. And you have a brother, Cosmo, who is an ecological composer, am I right? Is that the definition you use? And if you go on the web, and you could find a very interesting video of Merlin, and he does not only study fungi, he plays fungi as a musician, and he plays piano and fungi together. So, for those who haven't seen you playing fungi, could you explain what you do?
Yeah, it's quite there's quite a tangly story here. But when I finished my book, I inoculated the book with oyster mushrooms, and I let the mycelium grow through the pages of the book. And the idea was that I wanted to return my words to the creatures that I'm talking about. And the best thing about it was that then when they sprouted mushrooms, I could eat the mushrooms, and so eat my words. So this is my plan. I want to eat my words. What I didn't do, I only did it with the English edition. I don't know how it would have tasted in Italian or German. I should try. But then the question was, my brother raised this question. He was like, well, so Merlin, what do you think what do you think they're making of your writing? And I was like, I don't know. They're eating it when they're in the mycelial state. I can't tell what's going on for them, as they're digesting the book. Well, he said, why don't you send it to our friend, Michael Prime? Michael Prime is an acoustic ecologist, and he has a device where you can attach electrodes, like a little lie detector, to organisms. We can do it to ourselves, you can do it to plants, you can do it to anything. You can do it to fungi. So we sent him this book that was being digested by the fungus. He attached electrodes to the book. And what he then did is the micro fluctuations in electrical currents that he was detecting, he turned those into a sound. So the sound, you heard this wild clicking and bleeping, and that sound was a one-to-one representation of the electrical activity of the fungus as it devoured the book. So then there was this wild sound coming out of the fungus devouring the book, and then I played the piano along to that sound. So it's, yeah.
Well, go and look for it. I recommend. You come from a family, you told about your father before as a biologist, but you come from a family of scientists, of intellectuals. Your mother as well. She's a scientist, she worked on music, she worked with, oh God, I forgot the name.
Stockhausen.
Oh, okay. And I said that you play music since you were a child, and I listened recently to an interview on BBC Three. I think it was a couple of months ago. And you talked about music. And talking about Bach, you expressed all your admiration for this composer. But my problem is that you describe Bach as a fungal composer. Now, when I listened to you saying that, I thought about my musicologists colleagues at Rete 2. And I think that none of them has ever thought about Bach that way. So I promised to myself that tonight I would have asked you, because I think that they will all be, as we all are, I suppose, curious to know in which sense Bach is a fungal composer.
Good question. I'm glad you called me on that. So one of the confusing things about fungi is, we'll come back to this idea of these networks, the many growing tips. When you're trying to understand a fungal network without a center of operations, it has lots of growing tips. They're all growing and exploring as if independently, like a swarm, but they're all connected to each other in one continuous network. And you slide between thinking about this organism as a multitude of growing tips, and then you shuttle to, well, no, it's one interconnected whole. It's single, or it's plural, or it's single, or it's plural, and it's somehow both in this confusing way. And so this is where I started to think about polyphonic music. And polyphonic music is music that has more than one voice going on at the same time, exploring more than one musical story at the same time. And the work of Bach is a very great case of polyphonic music. You could take any one of the lines in a piece of Bach, and that would stand alone as its own piece of music. And you could take another line, and that would also stand alone. And when you listen to his music and listen to other types of polyphonic music and other polyphonic composers, there's this wild feeling of being immersed in lots of exploring stories, musical stories going on at once, which you can hear as separate stories exploring their own worlds, but it's not their own worlds because they're all sharing this world. And when you listen for a little bit longer, something weird happens, that you hear the whole. You hear the whole of the music. You have the music as one braided stream of exploring interconnected melodies. And this is why I talk about Bach in the context of fungi, because for me that was a very important way to learn to try and come closer to fungi, because I couldn't see any way to come close to these organisms which could be somehow singular and plural. And then I realized that our minds were quite elastic and could do remarkable things with our imaginations, and that these polyphonic composers could lead me to that place, which is why I described him in that sense.
So there's no end of history, there's no end of geography and explorations if we'll learn, or if we remember to go and look and to explore our world, what's under our eyes or in the soil. And so fungi can be a new lens, and I think you have shown it to us so well tonight, to interpret our old world. Quindi i funghi possono fornirci, no? Possono essere una nuova lente per vedere sotto una nuova prospettiva, in una nuova luce, il nostro vecchio mondo. Merlin Sheldrake, it really was a pleasure to have you here tonight. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Io vi ricordo che c'è anche la possibilità del firmacopie con Merlin Sheldrake su all'ultimo piano, dove avremo anche modo di mangiare un risotto ai funghi. Si poteva fare altrimenti, direi di no. Grazie a tutte e a tutti ancora, grazie.